Pompos, but back in the cold of Bogota. Our very special guest this week is none other than Gavin O'Toole. He's in London, and he is the brains, the editor, the creator behind the Latin American Review of Books that started in 2007 and is still going strong. So we're going to discuss this and, well, Gavin's interest in Latin America and books and speculations about what's going on in the region. Gavin, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for having me, and hello to all Colombia Calling loyal listeners.
We do have a good cohort of loyal listeners. It's very true, and you all know who you are because you've been with us since day one. But of course, there's always room for growth, and you know, let's get into this. Let's get into this growth thing. Gavin, you've been running the Latin American Review of Books since 2007. I assume you go through peaks and troughs in doing such a long-term project as this. That's what? How many years? 20. Something years now. I mean, that's a long time.
Yes. So let's just go back to the beginning. Why did I do this? I think I'll tell you a bit cynically at the time. I work in newspapers, and there is this wheeze in newspapers when you write book reviews, where you obviously get lots of free books. And it was a time in my life when I didn't have much cash, and I thought, how am I going to get some free books? So I launched. This was the actual original reason for launching it. I launched the Latin American Review of Books as a website, an early website. In order to get free books, and you know what, it worked. So I got to choose the books I received, and it satisfied my need at the time for free books, particularly politics books, because we don't do a huge amount of fiction or poetry or culture. And originally, because my wife likes film, we did film reviews, but we're not really doing that now. So it's mainly non-fiction books, but that was the original reason. But that was around 2005, and we were kind of experimenting. And I had a very good friend who I work with, called Richard Bartlett, a great guy. He's in Saudi Arabia right now, but he had launched a website called the African Review of Books, which was quite similar. And that was the inspiration, really. I thought that's a really good wheeze, because he did it for the same reason. He did it to get free books. And so I thought, I'm going to do that. And I launched my site, but he helped me build it. That was in the days before WordPress. So it's kind of migrated across platforms, eventually reaching, WordPress, which I think is kind of mainstream now. And we have more recently, in an effort to try and generate a bit of cash, launched a Substack equivalent. So it's on the website and it's also on Substack, but and started a few podcasts like your good self. So, we've evolved. There have been long periods where I've done nothing. So the Latin American Review of Books was, I think you'll find in the date lines, there's a year here or a year there where we haven't been very active, and that's been because of personal reasons. Obviously, I don't make a living from this. I work, so there have been periods when I've had to travel, or family issues. I just simply can't do it. But it's been in the last few years, we've been quite productive and quite regular. So ups and downs, which I'm sure you'll identify with yourself, Richard.
Well, there's times where I'm really happy, and like last week, Emily Hart, who is co-host on this, does the news or the Colombia briefing, and when she has time, she contributes as well podcasts, and she did one on this last week's one on San Agustin in Colombia, San Agustin Huila, with the anthropomorphic figurines, pre-Columbian sculptures and so on from San Agustin Huila. And I just love that kind of thing. And I've had great feedback from various angles and various sources who don't normally write in. And so that suddenly it's like, oh, this is what makes it all worthwhile. And then previous to that, a couple of podcasts ago, we had some coffee growers, but really, low level coffee growers doing the right thing for the native root coffee, and they wrote in to say, we've had orders from the UK, the US, and more interest in our product. And so again, that fills me with an enormous sense of well-being that we can do something. But when you get some of the rabid trolls out there, you sort of say, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself out there? But then again, you're in journalism, I'm in journalism. We do tend to have thicker skins about these things, but I feel that there's just so much more hatred out there. Or maybe it always existed, but at the same time, it's now immediate and right. It's right in your face straight away if you check your Twitter account or Facebook account or whatever you use, or you have comments open at the bottom of an article. Have you ever had real, sort of kickbacks and rejections of anything you've written?
Absolutely, yes. I've had some very vile comments and very personalized comments, but my feeling is, yes, as journalists, we have to have thick skins. We have to take it on the chin because that's our role. But what we're doing is good. You're doing good work. You're bringing to the attention of, in my case, readers, in your case, listeners, people, things, information and human interest and, important political stories that is the job of a journalist. So I take pride in that, but I also think that the better that we, the more quality that we give to our product, the less of a chance, the less of an opportunity they have, the vile, people out there, to criticize it. Because what are they going to do? Are they going to be able to do something the equivalent quality of the equivalent quality? I doubt it. So you need to know your stuff. You need to write well, or talk well, or present well. And the better it is, I think, the less opportunity you give them to troll, because these people are opportunists. They don't take the time. They don't put the work in to learn about a region, to do the background. Look at you. You've studied Latin America. You've done a PhD. This isn't coming from nowhere. You're not like someone off the street. This is a real, as you say, a labor of love, but it's also real expertise you're bringing to bear here. These people often do not have that. It's a passing fancy. They can make a quick quip or a vile comment, and they're off, and they're gone, and they disappear into the ether. So, frankly, I don't. I've got a friend who writes a lot about Palestine, and I'm afraid he gets a lot of very, very serious trolling and very, he gets death threats, all kinds of stuff. But he's grown so used to it, really, and he's quite a feisty, sort of pugnacious chap. But I worry sometimes about his well-being, because I think it probably over time does take a bit of a toll. But for you and I, certainly, it's never really bothered me. So frankly, I'm just going to keep doing what I do.
Yeah, I do love that this was, a way of getting free books. I do absolutely, entirely relate to this. I do get a fair amount of free books, but at the same time, I do get people going, oh, yeah. I'm like, well, you're going to get publicity. I don't mind if they're PDFs as well, because I'm going to read them. And I did notice on your website, you are no longer accepting physical copies. Is it you just got no more space?
I absolutely ran out of space. I was overwhelmed with books, and I had to say I'll only take PDFs now because I don't want to. These are great books. These are beautiful objects. They're beautiful things to have. I love dipping into them. The trouble is, when you're dealing with so many, first of all, you run out of space. But secondly, it would be lovely if I could sell them on to a third party and make a bit of cash. But sadly, Latin America is too niche. It's not mainstream enough to do that. So they just pile up. Yeah, I've literally had piles of books, a room so full of books that you can't get into it. So no more, no longer. I've got rid of all of them, and it's sad, but it has to be done.
I love that. I love that. But this is, you've touched on an incredibly important point. Is it, our affection, knowledge, and for this region, it is not the sphere of influence, let's say, for the UK. We're both obviously from the UK. It's not the sphere of influence. You get small periods of interest, and of course, right now, Venezuela. But as we record this, the elections were on the 28th. It's now August the 1st. So a few days have passed, and you can already see a dip in the UK press about what's going on there. And of course, there have been serious developments, instability in the Middle East, in Iran, and that will take over. And Ukraine, of course, rightly so, has front page coverage, and the Olympics are taking a lot. And so we're always swimming against the current here in Latin America, which is trying, but again, it was our choice to follow Latin America. But I guess, I do a lot of this reporting on Colombia Calling or elsewhere, and analysis and what have you, and you do the Latin American Review of Books to continue to keep some of this up there in the public eye, I suppose. And I wonder, when we look at something like Venezuela, which people will start saying, oh, Venezuela fatigue. You've obviously seen this in so many other different places. A few months ago, there was nothing else but Ecuador. A few months before that, there was nothing else but El Salvador. It must be trying each time when you're looking at a region and then saying, well, this will be a flash in the pan for a week.
Well, it's the nature of journalism. I mean, the trouble with journalism is ultimately a commercial sort of pursuit. And the way newspapers work is that they kind of compete with others over the same story. So I've been in a newsroom many a time where late at night they've ripped up a front page or parts of a front page to get in a story simply because the rival newspaper had it. They may not be telling you anything else. They're just telling, they just need to have that story because the rival's got it. This is the nature of journalism. It's just a very competitive commercial sort of enterprise. And so those interests, they do say there's this idea in newspapers that what's interesting about newspapers is not what's in them, but what's not in them. And I kind of subscribe to that, because really that loss of interest does show just how fickle our sort of news agenda and what would you call it, our sort of long-term interest in news is. It's just a passing fancy. Very often when it comes to Latin America, Britain tends to, I feel quite strongly, concentrate on themes that, the United States is interested in, and there may be foreign relations reasons for that, but if you look at Venezuela, Britain, certainly under the Tories prior to this new government, used to almost toe the exact same line towards Venezuela as the Americans. So I think there's a lot of geopolitical kind of dodging and weaving going on when it comes to Britain's relationship with Latin America. In fact, Richard, this is an interesting story, because you did a PhD, I know that, and I did one a long time ago, and I had to go and interview, as part of it, the Mexican ambassador in London, whose name was Santiago Oñate. A very nice man, typical kind of Mexican grandee, and he welcomed me. We had a chat about Mexico and the United States, and he was very, very honest. This is the Mexican ambassador. He said, well, look, ultimately, Britain doesn't have much interest in Mexico because it's the United States that calls the tune in Mexico. This is the ambassador. He was being honest. We all know that's true. We all know that, there's this kind of effectively a neo-colonial relationship between these two countries. You can't deny it. And he was just being very candid. But Britain doesn't have that level of influence. It doesn't have that leverage, that kind of direct relationship with a country like Mexico that the United States clearly does. So we just fall into line as part of the kind of Anglo-American capitalist world. We just, we don't set our own agenda. We follow someone else's agenda.
But and your real love in Latin America, your first love is Mexico. Is that what you studied as well? Is that what you did your sort of PhD thesis in?
Yes. So I went to Mexico traveling when I was a much younger man, and I kind of fell in love with Mexico, as one does, as you fell in love with Colombia.
Yeah.
So I married a Mexican girl. My wife is Mexican, and we settled here in Britain. But then I decided I wanted to study Latin America because there was lots of things I wanted to learn about. So I studied Latin American politics, but then I eventually did postgrad work, and I studied specifically Mexico, Mexican nationalism and revolutionary nationalism. So the kind of nationalism of the Mexican Revolution, which even today, for some reason, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Most people would fall asleep if you told them that. But I don't. I can't understand. I can't explain it.
Not I, because Mexico right now after the election is so very interesting, and especially in this month period of the overlap, but as Obrador has sort of control of I would say Congress while Sheinbaum is taking over. I just find it, it's absolutely, this again should be in the news, shouldn't it? It's that what's going on, and nationalism in Mexico is something that I don't know. It tickles my interest more than it probably should, but I think it should be timely, and it should be considered, certainly, especially by the US right now. I mean, the number one, the trading partner, the neighbor, and of course with the whole story of migrants and what's going on. And of course, this is a huge debate for the November elections in the US. And of course, the presumptive nominee, Kamala Harris. I would happily sit down over a coffee with you and entirely alienate all of my listeners to talk about Mexico.
Yeah, well, no, migration is the issue of our era. This is, I get a lot of books, or I was getting a lot of books about migration, less so, frankly, now. But it's really interesting how, over time, the sort of the interests have evolved. But the latest book we've reviewed on our website, on Latin American Review Books, is a very a masterful, epic history of the recent border crisis. A book by a writer called Jonathan Blitzer. Everyone who is gone is here, and it's very honest. It's a very candid book because really it tells us, I suppose, what we all probably suspected and knew, is that the crisis, if that's what you care to call it, on the southern border, is very much of America's own making, because of the policies it's adopted, both outside of the United States, its foreign policy towards Central America, but also within the United States, its very confused and messy asylum and immigration policies, which have never followed any. This is one of the big myths about American policymaking. We assume, because it is, what you might call the hegemon, but it is the world's superpower, it is the world's richest country, that the policy there is made rationally and, according to a sort of a kind of technocratic standard that's the envy of the developed world. The truth is very, very different. The United States policymaking in the States is a mess. In fact, things like immigration policy has been nothing but a mess. And if you read Jonathan Blitzer's book, you'll understand why. And that's really at the root of the crisis. Bad policy creates crises.
It's on my list, and of course I was made aware of it by the Latin American Review of Books. So there you go, nice, another plug, latamrob.com. But I was made aware. It is on my list of things to read. I will ask about that. Does Blitzer's investigation span all the way south, Panama and beyond?
No, the crisis, so to speak, right now is characterized mainly by very large flows of migration from Central America.
Mm-hmm.
Although, actually, in the last year or so, there's been increasing flows from countries like Venezuela and further south. But very sensibly, he's focused on the kind of main event, which between 2010 and 2020 was a kind of dramatic demographic shift in the character of mass migration into the United States. So until about 2014, and this is again of interest when it comes to Mexico, when people in the United States talked about undocumented migrants and illegal migration, they call it here, they were mainly talking about Mexico and Mexicans. And but then in about between 2010 and 2014, that actually began to change. And from 2014 onwards, a very large number of Central Americans started making their way through the southern border. And it's now become more of a Central American crisis than it is a kind of Mexican crisis. And that's actually bad news for Mexico, because Mexico obviously it's the transit country for Central American migrants. Now it's got choices. What does it do? It's not a particularly wealthy country. It's certainly not an institutionally strong country. It doesn't have the infrastructure necessarily to deal with the level of migration that we're seeing. And so anything that happens, any policy that's made in Washington to do with illegal migration will affect Mexico. And unfortunately, AMLO, López Obrador in Mexico, has had to fall in line to a certain extent with American policymaking, even though it goes against the grain. And it's a classic example of where Mexico, whereas it wants to chart its own course from that kind of nationalistic reflex, it simply can't. It just doesn't have the ability to somehow subvert US policymaking in a matter like this.
Yeah, we obviously have this it's a big issue here, but of course Colombia acquiesces totally and allows the migrants through, to get to the Darien, and it strikes me as incredibly counterproductive in Panama to try and throw up a sort of razor wire across the Darien Gap. It just will end up pushing more people through even more dangerous setups and having to rely entirely on illegal groups to get through. And I just think that this is one of the big issues of our time. You sort of get this feeling that it should be addressed in the similar way to, I guess, sort of post World War II. When we sat down to say what needs to be done here and what needs to be done there, this needs to be a totally international Congress agreeing. But it's so complex when you look at, again, this part of the world, and then the migrants crossing the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and why are they coming in from Syria? And it's just heartbreaking to watch these things. But when we could wax lyrically around this for a while, but I feel that I want to look a little bit more at the front page of the Latin American Review of Books, because you do have a sort of a blog and a podcast section, and there's a story that really flew under the radar obviously it was mentioned. I think the BBC mentioned it, maybe the Times mentioned it, maybe the Guardian, but then beyond that, it just fell away. And our beloved former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a rapid trip out to Venezuela. And I just think it's just one of those things. Obviously, he was cashing in. There was money involved in him getting out there. David Cameron, who at that point was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, didn't really make any mention of it. I think he said a few things. What on earth, Gavin, you who study this, who looks at this and watches it, you're in the UK, what on earth was Boris Johnson doing in Venezuela a couple of months ago?
Yeah, it was such an interesting story. Why would Boris Johnson find it? Well, first of all, the story that he gave is he was on holiday in the Caribbean, but he wanted to make a contribution to sort of British foreign policy by convincing, Nicolas Maduro, to hold free elections, which was the British policy at the time. But also, there were kind of two things going on at that time. First of all, there was talk in the UK of Boris making a political comeback.
Yeah.
And it was felt that this possibly was just a very strange, kind of effort by the blonde bombshell to raise his profile at a particular time, which it's very strange. It just shows how kind of, in many ways, how inept he is in certain aspects of politics, because I can guarantee, and we both recognize this, that most people would struggle to find Venezuela on a map in this country. And so this would be a very strange thing to do. But that was one story. And then the other story was that Venezuela is in this kind of quite vociferous dispute with neighboring Guyana about Essequibo, over very large oil deposits that have been found sort of just off the coast in a disputed region, and it is disputed. And if you look at the history, there's no doubt that there is a need for a sort of geopolitical resolution to this dispute, because it's like everything else. You may decry Venezuela for its sort of bellicose treatment of a very small and weak little country. But at the end of the day, Guyana's behaved quite badly. It's just let the American oil companies drill without any consultation, given that this is disputed territory. So, they need to sit down around a table and kind of thrash out some of the historical legal issues over Essequibo before any sense of, consensus can be achieved. But that was the sort of backstory to the famous Boris visit. So your assumption with a character like Boris is that, well, what's that all about? Is there something in it for him to do with? But then more details came out later, and he said he was there on behalf of a British hedge fund manager. Now that raises a huge number of questions about what would a hedge fund manager be interested in Venezuela for, and the Venezuelan elections. Well, obviously it's to do with oil, and so maybe there was something in that. Maybe there was a suggestion that Boris, was set to gain from this, and he has been on the international circuit making lots and lots of money from this kind of activity. And there is a third theory, and that's, I mentioned this in the podcast. It just so happened. So Boris has made himself, like Winston Churchill, the champion in Europe, and certainly when he was prime minister, of Ukraine. And he's a big pal with Vladimir Zelensky, and has kind of talked up the Ukrainian defense of the West in terms similar to Winston Churchill. And Boris has written about Winston Churchill. In fact, he wrote a biography about Winston Churchill, and he actually believes he is the reincarnation of Winston Churchill. And it just so happened Boris was in Caracas just days later, days after Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was in Caracas. Now, why would that be? One really has to ask questions about that, given that Boris had set himself up as the spokesman internationally of Ukraine. I don't know. I speculated that they were discussing behind the scenes Ukraine. It's, as I said to you earlier, it's well known that the West wants an exit strategy. They're basically alluding to that right now, where this very costly war can be brought to an end. Was Boris talking to Russian officials in Caracas out of the public eye about Ukraine? I don't know. Was he talking to them about Essequibo and Guyanese oil, or Venezuela's claim to that oil? Who knows? Whatever it was, we'll never find out with Boris. But the point is, it will never be clear with Boris anyway. So whatever he told you probably isn't what he was doing.
I held my nose and read his book on Churchill.
Was it any good? I haven't read it.
He writes exactly as he speaks. And so you sort of read it expecting him to you sort of read it in that way. It wasn't a bad book, but again, it was the way you read it all the way through, and it kind of feels like the justification for Boris for everything he does as well. You know, he's a misunderstood leader for our times, and so it wasn't bad. I'm not recommending it. I'm not gonna, but I read it very fast and held my nose through it. Fair enough. Again, Boris in Venezuela. It's just one of those. It's just one of those stories. You're like, what is going on? And of course, as he was, if he was representing a British hedge fund manager, it does seem quite likely. I was looking today, 2nd of August, that I guess it was yesterday, that the head of the sort of group that was the 2020 mercenary group that failed out of Colombia into Venezuela, he was jailed today or yesterday after being found guilty for running weapons and arms dealing and so on. So it's all so much intrigue going on right now. And I really, again, come back to this point because it's so topical at the moment. Venezuela needs to be on the front page. But I think if we look at more at the website and the page, the Latin American Review of Books, I mean, it does absolutely, it beggars belief how much you cover and how much you must read, and just the extent and the breadth of everything. Because I read some months ago, I think it was the book on Plan Condor, I think it was, from the Southern Cone. And of course I looked it up, and because it's an academic book, it's so wretchedly expensive. But I really want to read it. So your message is getting out there to me, but at the same time, I'm like, oh man alive, this is expensive. But I will in time, because unlike you, I still have space in my library and on my bookshelves to put these books up. What's coming up next? I know you go through periods where you don't work because, again, life and work get in the way. But you must have a list of books now that have been sent in. What have you got coming up that you can give us a little insight on?
You know what? I haven't right now. I was just saying this morning I have to go and get some new books because I'm kind of running out. I've got a great book. I have actually got a great book about Venezuela. Let me just get it. This will be coming up very soon. It's called Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of US Empire by Anya Parampil. Now, obviously, from a title, you'll be able to tell where the sympathies lie, but it's about the coup attempt against Maduro. Was it Maduro? Yeah, hold on. Dramatic attempt to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, intervention by which, despite open backing by the United States, failed spectacularly. Look, wherever you stand on issues like, the Venezuelan dictatorship, and we know it is a dictatorship, at the end of the day, as a journalist, you've got to be able to give both sides of the story. And I will always be prepared to point out the incessant, endless meddling in Venezuelan and no doubt Colombian and certainly Mexican affairs by the United States. This is really, really important. If we want to understand the way Latin America is, we have to understand the way the US behaves towards it, because you'd just be ignoring one of the biggest pieces of the equation if you didn't. And Venezuela has been, without a shadow of a doubt, the target of US interference. And so, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to defend Maduro and his behavior. But at the end of the day, it's not a simple question of one man screwing up a country. It's a question of a dynamic screwing up a country, which he is certainly painted in the US and British press as being responsible for.
On that topic, then, if we were to look at sort of great big sort of umbrella style books to recommend to our listeners to have a good background in what has gone on, not focusing on the minutiae of issues within each country, but the overall issues in Latin America. I mean, my immediately go-to book would be The Open Veins of Latin America, Galeano. But would you, in your vast knowledge, have other books that you would recommend for our listeners?
Yes. Definitely, and I'm going to, if you will permit me, I'll go through a range of titles I've got here, because there is an awful lot of really good stuff about U.S. relations with Latin America. And I think if you come to the study or even the interest in Latin America, this is something you just simply can't ignore. And there's a whole history of it. And a lot of these books, I must say, are written by U.S. scholars, so they're not Latin Americans, being defensive. What you would call sort of anti-imperialism has a very strong kind of foundation in U.S. scholarship. So let's just go through some historical themes, first of all, going back prior to the U.S. Domination, would obviously look at European imperialism. And there's lots of ways historians have tended to do that. A particularly good title is by John Charles Chasteen, Oxford University Press, and that's called Americanos, Latin America's Struggle for Independence. And he actually looks at this notion of America in the period of anti-imperialism against, Spain, and he looks at it as the sort of the origin of a kind of sense of regional identity, which was then, so when we say America, we obviously assume the United States, but Americanos, the original term, was used in Latin America routinely to refer to independent-minded local, Creoles, and the monopoly wasn't just the United States in those days. That's a really interesting point of departure for looking at kind of the whole history of imperialism in Latin America and European imperialism. But there's lots of different ways historians have looked at European imperialism. One of them, the really interesting ones I've came across recently, was called Llamas Beyond the Andes, and it's about the history of camelids, which is really interesting because camelids were taken by the Europeans, the French and the British and the Spanish, as kind of exotic examples of this new fauna that they had discovered in Latin America, and they were taken all over the world. And there's this very famous stuffed llama in Paris, and a woman has written a book around the idea of this. It's quite sad, really, but it's also a very interesting way of looking at European fascination and how a European imperialism worked its way through. But then we obviously in the 19th century the US becomes the kind of clearly the ambitious dominant power, and some of the great titles which look at that include, there's a title by Brian Loveman, University of California Press, No Higher Law, American Foreign Policy in the Western Hemisphere. Since 1776, it looks at the history of U.S. Foreign policy towards Latin America. Another one, similar historical approach, writings from Spanish America about the U.S. in the 19th century. So that's called Looking North, and it's edited by John Hassett and Braulio Munoz. Again, more recent period of history, the sort of late 1890s to early this century, how US interventions tended to be related to protection of American property, and that's called The Empire Trap by Noel Maurer. There's a brilliant book called Empire and Dissent by Fred Rosen. The sort of that's all about the informal imperialism, the US, because the US has obviously never admitted to being an imperial power, and its imperialism is very different to European imperialism, which was direct military control. More recent books look at sort of modern manifestations of old phenomena, the Monroe Doctrine through the War on Terror, for example. So there's a great book by Grace Livingstone, who's a great writer. I'd recommend her to anyone, called America's Backyard.
Oh, yes.
And that's really about how the War on Terror reflects there's sort of more kind of, what would you call it, superior thinking in the north towards the south. A really good book by Daniel Immerwahr, I'll spell that for you, Immerwahr, by Bodley Head, is called How to Hide an Empire, a short history of the United States. And it really does look at precisely this issue about the United States being an empire in everything but name. It will not admit to being an empire. So how do you hide it? And it's, how American kind of discourse and rhetoric conceals its imperial ambition. And there's loads of others. There's others that look at sort of more direct phenomena like extractivism.
Yes.
Or there's a great book you'll be familiar with, I'm sure, called Jungle Capitalists by Peter Chapman. He's a journalist, and he looks at the sort of treachery and greed associated with United Fruit, which I think probably had holdings in Colombia at some stage.
Yes, they did.
So there's lots of ways of coming at this issue. The ones I like are the ones that expose the hypocritical reality. And a good example of that would be a book called Back Channel to Cuba by William Leogrand and Peter Kornblue. And that's about a long history since the Cuban Revolution of direct diplomatic negotiations between the US and Cuba, which kind of defies the image that the US gives under the embargo of a country that's under siege. It's actually had a phone line to Havana ever since, and they talk. It's quite crazy. And then I've become personally interested in more recent years in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is often called the last colony, and it is still a colony. Puerto Rico is a remarkable country in many ways because it's got a status that has been sort of purposefully obfuscated by the United States to simply to avoid the reality that they don't know what to do with it. And so Puerto Rican political forces are divided along kind of three lines, really. One of them is the status quo, the messy status quo, which is no resolution, which is bad for Puerto Rico, and it's certainly very bad for its economy. One of them is statehood, which has gained ground and obviously gets a lot of support in the United States. The problem being, it's a bit like Northern Ireland. There's not a lot. It's not sure that the United States actually wants Puerto Rico. It's a drain on its resources. It's expensive, and the last thing they want is a bunch of millions of Puerto Ricans coming to live in America. And the third issue, of course, the third possibility is independence, and the independence movement in Puerto Rico is quite fascinating because it sort of reflects a kind of genuine residual survival of nationalism despite all the things that have been thrown at it. But that, sadly, is the sort of weakest option in Puerto Rican possibilities. What else? Yes, other ways of looking at imperialism or coming to US relations would be through the Central American civil wars, the guerrilla wars, which didn't happen in a vacuum. They were obviously proxy wars for, a larger conflict, which we're all familiar with from our own backgrounds, which is the Cold War. And tragically, the role of the US in Latin America has been nothing but reprehensible when it comes to Central America because of its support for these very brutal dictatorships and for the sort of counter-revolutionary forces that generated a lot of violence in places like Nicaragua.
I'd like, if I can jump in a second.
Yes.
I want to. This is something that I've been looking up through. I guess it's the National Security Archives out of Georgetown. I'm looking for the UK's, Britain's influence in the Cold War in Latin America. Obviously, beyond Chile. My personal interest being here in Colombia. There are documents to say that there was influence. Have you read up on this? Have you seen anything?
I'm thinking British influence during the Cold War in Latin America.
But like in Colombia in specific, particularly.
In Colombia in specific, no, I haven't. Although obviously Britain has always had big oil interests in Colombia.
Yes.
But I would imagine that Britain has always played out its interests through the US embassy
Mm.
or through the US. What I would say is that there are more Colombians in London than any other Latin American group, and that's because of this favourable regime that Britain have maintained because of their oil interests. So there's clearly been a quid pro quo, a kind of trade-off there with Colombia. The British have always been much more practical, I think, in terms of the diplomacy, mainly because I don't think they ever had imperial designs on Latin America, direct imperial designs. I think they all were quite content to leave it to the United States, and that would fit what my ambassador told me back in the day about Britain sort of deferring to US leadership in Latin America, and that would be, I think, sensible from a business point of view. And a good example of that right now would be what's happening in Guyana. So the oil majors that are basically buying up the Guyanese government are ExxonMobil and the big US oil companies. Britain does have a couple of smaller players there, but Britain seems to be quite content to have a toe in the water, but not necessarily to be running the show. I think that's actually emblematic of the British attitude towards Latin America. As long as they've got a stake, they're going to be happy. And that certainly would reflect the British government's trade agenda over the years, which has waxed and wanes along those lines. Suddenly they discover Latin America and it's a trade opportunity. And then they forget all about it.
Discovered post-Brexit, of course, as well. Suddenly we need to size up some trade deals here. Sell biscuits to Latin America. I think we've had a really amazing overview. In fact, I wouldn't even call it an overview, Gavin, an in-depth look at the literary offering for those of you out there interested, of course, in the region. I can recommend no greater page on this subject. It's the Latin American Review of Books. And so that website is latamrob.com. There's a Substack link on there. You can sign up to follow. Very inexpensive to get all of the additional content. Support people who are doing things of this nature. And of course, I have a huge thank you to Gavin for reviewing the 2 books brought out by my tiny editorial company. First and foremost, Barry Max Will's book, Better Than Cocaine, Learning to Grow Coffee and Live in Colombia, which received a beautiful write-up entitled Paradise Found. And of course, my own book on Colombia at a Crossroads, a historic and social biography, which was, again, very, very kindly reviewed as well. They're both available in print here in Colombia and, of course, online on the usual page, the usual suspect of Amazon, but hopefully soon in bookshops around the world. This is something I've been working on this. Gavin, let me take this moment to say thank you so much for your time and really unrivaled knowledge on books and Latin America.
Thank you for having me, Richard. I'm very grateful, and I wish you all the luck in the world with your own ventures and your own podcast. Because what we do, I think both of us, what we do is important. It's
a struggle, but these things do bring great reward. When you hit the right sweet spot with a person who's interested, and then suddenly it feels worthwhile again. I take this moment again to say thank you so much to Gavin O'Toole of the Latin American Review of Books. Of course, we'll be putting up a list of the books that he's recommended, links to his website, and of course, Substack on our Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/Columbia Calling. You can sign up there. They'll all be made available. And of course, we'll link those things to Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media outlets that we participate in. I've been Richard Mccoll here in Bogota, Colombia, speaking to Gavin O'Toole. It's been a great episode, number 530. We will be back next week with further episodes about Colombia and the region. Of course, if you haven't already, tune into last week's episode with Emily Hart discussing, San Agustin Huila and, of course, the theft and hopefully return of many of these antique and pre-Columbian sculptures from the area. Anyhow, that's us signing off for today. Thank you and farewell.